If you're one of the few brave souls still playing first-person shooter games on mouse and keyboard against soft aimbot, controller players, I'm going to go over some settings and tips that have helped me when it comes to gameplay and aiming mechanics on mouse and keyboard in Xdefiant. First, we have to go over some basic settings to make sure that we're all on the same page. Number 1, cap your FPS. If you have an NVIDIA graphics card, I recommend you cap it from the NVIDIA control panel instead of in the game. The reason for this is that sometimes you can get screen tearing when you cap it in-game, so it's better to just do it at the source. Number 2, while we're here, go ahead and make sure VSync is enabled in the NVIDIA control panel and make sure that it's disabled in your game settings of Xdefiant. Number 3, make sure you have NVIDIA Reflex low latency set to on plus boost to reduce any input lag. Next, we need to go over some graphic settings. Now, these may vary from person to person, but the purpose here is to make sure you're locked in at the highest available frames per second for your setup. On screen right now are my current settings, and I run an EVGA 3080 and I play at 1440p resolution, 144 frames per second. I'm not one of those people that cranks their settings so low that the game looks like it's a PlayStation 2 game, but I definitely make sure that I'm getting the right balance between performance and quality. And the last setting that I recommend is to go into any programs that you have running in the background and disable any game overlays like Discord, Nvidia, or the Ubisoft Connect overlay. Unfortunately, using these overlays can cause stuttering in-game, and that's one of the most annoying things to deal with on mouse and keyboard. But if you find the game works fine with them, then obviously go ahead and leave it. Just wanted to go over this because there might be a few of you out there that see improvement by disabling them. Next, we need to go over how sensitivity works in Xdefiant. At the moment, we don't really have a per optic sensitivity or relative scaling like other games, and there are a few things that are a little bit off in Xdefiant. Real quick warning before we do that, I just wanted to mention, whatever DPI you're running on your mouse right now, do not change it. Blue FPS did some digging and found out that there's some weird math happening in the game. In theory, if you cut your DPI in half but double your in-game sense, you should have exactly the same sensitivity, but for some reason in Xdefiant, that's not how it works. So the first thing we need to do is fix our ADS sense. Now, in most games, I play on a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning my aim down sight sensitivity and hipfire sensitivity are identical, but for whatever reason, the default 1 setting is way slower than the hipfire sense. So to get to that 1-to-1 feel, I had to bump the low zoom ADS sense all the way up to 1.2. So if you're a person who typically likes to play with a slower aim down sight sense, then something around the default 1.0 setting should be fine. But for me, having it on 1.2 was the best feel. Now, the high zoom sense is the complete opposite. It felt extremely fast. So to get that in line with how it feels in other games like Apex and Call of Duty, I had to crank it down to 0.85. Next, we need to talk about the optics because this is where it gets a little bit weird. A low zoom ADS sense applies to everything from iron sights up to a 4x zoom level, and the high zoom for everything above that. Now, the problem with the 4x optic is it's considered a low zoom. So if you're like me and you dialed it up to 1.2 to get that 1-to-1 sensitivity feeling, then this is going to feel horrendous because it's comically fast. Now, you can always change your low zoom ADS every time you use the 4x optic, but let's be real, who's got time for that? Unfortunately, that makes the 4x off limits for me. Now, this is just my opinion, but there are some weapons that are a little bit better or more usable on mouse and keyboard and some to avoid, at least if you're trying to be as competitive as possible. Feel free to disagree or grill me in the comments, or if you figured out something that I haven't yet, drop the knowledge for us. The first weapon I would recommend avoiding for now is the MDR. This gun isn't great in general, but it feels even worse on mouse and keyboard. It's got a decent amount of recoil, so it's hard to compete with ARs at those long to mid-range gunfights, and its mobility and time to kill up close aren't great either. You can get away with using the MDR on controller a lot of times because the aim assist helps smooth out the deficiencies, but I just find that unless I'm on top of my game, the MDR just doesn't feel that great on mouse and keyboard. The next weapon I would recommend avoiding is the MK20. I know at times it can be really strong, but it's a high risk, high reward type of weapon. The fire rate is slow, and so is its mobility. If you miss one shot, almost any other weapon in the game is going to kill you before you get that next bullet out, unless the enemy is an absolute bot. The fire rate is slow, and in most situations, you'd be better off just running a sniper at those longer ranges because the MK20 doesn't have a one-shot kill potential, with one exception. If you use the heavy barrel and play as the cleaners, when you hit a headshot, it doesn't kill them right away, but the burn damage does end up finishing them off. Now, you can definitely get away with using the MK20 in mouse and keyboard only lobbies, but if you're in a mixed lobby with controller players, you're probably going to have a bad time. This next one might be a bit controversial, but hear me out. The Vector is a great gun overall. However, it has terrible range, as it should, and a very short magazine. Now, this weapon is very good if you have input-based matchmaking on and you're in a game with only mouse and keyboard players, but if you're playing cross input where there are other controller players in the game, what's going to end up happening is you'll be forced into very close range gunfights where aim assist has a massive advantage. If you're a top mouse and keyboard player, you can definitely still make it work, but if not, you're more than likely going to have a hard time against controller players who don't miss a bullet up close. So what guns are the best on mouse and keyboard? My number one pick is the best weapon in the entire game. The AK-47 is very good on mouse and keyboard in my opinion. Extremely competitive time to kill at all ranges, good mobility, and recoil that's relatively easy to control. control. The AK also has very good iron sights, which lets you add another attachment to actually improve the weapon, so you get a little extra flexibility in building it to fit your playstyle. Number 2, of course, we have to mention it, the MP7. This is another weapon that's just all around great for similar reasons to the AK. Good iron sights, good mobility, controllable recoil, and the fast fire rate makes it very forgiving. And what I really like about the iron sights of this gun is that they're relatively tall and thin. On screen right now, I'm just going to overlay the other SMGs just so you can kind of see the difference between the iron sights on all of them. And I think you'll see how much more visibility you get with the MP7 iron sights, which is really important on mouse and keyboard since obviously you can't shoot what you can't see. Compared to controller with aim assist, you can kind of get away with a little bit less visibility because rotational aim assist kicks in and keeps you on target. Number 3 is going to be a two-part answer, and I think you'll see why, and that's going to be both of the snipers. In their current state, even post-nerf with the flinch, snipers are still incredibly strong. Now, the reason I say these are strong on mouse and keyboard is because we obviously have much better precision or fine aim control, as well as the ability to flick the targets much faster. So in a game where the time to kill is on the longer side, having a one-shot weapon is incredibly powerful. Whether you want to sit back with the TAC 50 or run around trying to quickscope people with the M44 is up to you. You have a little bit of an extra advantage here if you're in mixed input lobbies with controller players, because a lot of times you'll be using snipers at ranges where it's really hard for controller players to challenge you, and even if they do, you'll easily be able to back up into cover and reset the fight. Number 4, the last one on this list, is an honorable mention and honestly one of my personal favorites. Now, on paper, it's not the best gun. It's decent, but not the obvious choice. The M249 is absolutely a solid gun, and there's a few reasons. Number 1, the slower mobility normally would be a bad thing, but it's slow enough that it actually forces you to be more thoughtful about your positioning. And number 2, you get a metric ton of ammo even with the 60 round mag, and like we mentioned before, in game with a longer time to kill, killing multiple enemies can be really difficult just because of how much health there is. But with the larger mag sizes, if you position yourself well, you can literally take out 4 people holding hands on the objective. And the last reason I like it is because the gun basically has 0 recoil, which makes it really friendly for most mouse and keyboard players, and I find that I can compete with aim assist because of how easy it is to control. Now, if I missed your favorite gun, relax, these are just my personal opinions and recommendations, so if you found a sneaky build or you think I'm wrong, I'd love to argue, discuss it with you in the comments. Next, we're going to get into some tactics and gameplay mechanics, but before we do that, if you're enjoying the video so far, drop a like on it, and if you want to see more content on Xdefiant or other first-person shooter games, consider dropping a sub. One thing I've noticed about the way that recoil works in Xdefiant is that while the game may not have a lot of recoil compared to games like PUBG or CSGO, the initial recoil is pretty aggressive, especially when you compare that to games like Call of Duty or Apex Legends, where the recoil starts out pretty manageable and gets more aggressive over time. So I've started doing 2 things a little differently here in Xdefiant that have definitely helped me land more shots. When you start firing, the gun kicks pretty hard and the distance between the first few bullets is actually pretty big. So I've started to anticipate this, and I recommend pulling down pretty hard the second you start firing your weapon. Try it out in the firing range to really get a good feel and take a mental note of just how much the gun jumps, and also pay close attention to the horizontal recoil because some of these weapons the first bullet kicks sideways quite a bit. The second thing I found helpful to combat this is to actually aim or center your crosshair slightly lower. Now, it's a bad habit to aim at the floor, but conventional crosshair centering advice is to place your crosshair at the upper chest height. But for Xdefiant, I found it much more helpful to aim more at the belly button or even the belt buckle, depending on how far away the enemy is. This will give you a bit more forgiveness when the recoil starts kicking in. Now, if you've seen my other tips video where I said aim for the head and you're thinking I'm contradicting myself, let me clarify. What I meant in that video is that you need to be landing headshots to reduce the time to kill. So aiming directly for the head at first can make it very difficult to land your shots. So sorry if I misspoke, but hopefully that clears things up. Positioning yourself well in gunfights can literally make or break your entire play session. I noticed that a lot of times when I'm having a bad day and I want to jump on the bad servers complaining bandwagon, I'm just inserting myself into fights in the worst way possible, and it gets worse and worse because the more I die, the more frustrated and less patient I become. Oftentimes, the only thing that fixes it is for me to slow down, go back to the basics, and one pretty funny movement technique that I'll talk about in a minute. Now, don't get me wrong, sometimes you absolutely have to throw your body on the objective to win, but the basics are still important. Make sure you play cover, don't get caught out in the open unless you're playing the B flag on Noodleplex, have an exit strategy if things go south, keep your teammates close to back you up, and these are the fundamentals you really have to build habits for unless you're a top tier player who never misses shots, aim trains for a living, and huffs G fuel before you get on. And this is extra true for mouse and keyboard players because we're limited by our human reaction time. So if we get caught off guard, there's a lower chance you're coming out on top of that gunfight. The average human reaction time is around 250 milliseconds, so by the time you notice an enemy coming out of nowhere, they've basically been able to put 2 or 3 shots into you. And you might say, well, yes, wouldn't that also affect controller players? And the answer is Kind of. If an enemy unexpectedly rounds a corner in front of a controller player, aim assist will kick in and has basically a 0 millisecond reaction time. So in some situations, aim assist can smooth out some of the more human gaps in your gameplay. As a mouse and keyboard player, you need to get a feel for exactly where the sweet spot is when it comes to what ranges you take fights at. Up close and point blank often feels really bad, especially with the way player collision works in the game, and it feels like those fights kind of come down to luck of the draw with whoever manages to bounce off the other player facing the right direction. But part of this is also just being mindful of the weapon type and style you're playing. If you're using an SMG, don't stand there and try to challenge people at range, and if you're running an LMG, stay away from the more narrow parts of the map. Now, I don't know if this is a helpful tip, but I find that it works more than it should and is hilarious. When you're in a gunfight and you feel like you and the other player are jumping and sliding all over the place, just mix in a simple crouch and stand still for a brief moment. This usually works because it's so unexpected and most people just don't do it. It's especially effective against other mouse and keyboard players because a lot of time when you're tracking a target, you're sort of predicting where they're going to move. And so when you throw in a stop and crouch, it's almost like breaking a controller player's camera, and I find it hilarious. So try this out next time you boot up the game and let me know how it works for you. One of my favorite parts about playing Xdefiant is that it can be difficult with all the different factions and abilities. There's quite a bit to learn, especially if you're coming from a game like Call of Duty. If you're looking for some tips to improve your overall gameplay, check out my video on how to stop dying in Xdefiant, or if you want to check out one of my other videos, click here.